The Arizona Territory sun blazed mercilessly overhead on September 15, 1879. As the A stagecoach on the Tucson line wound its way through the crimson maze of Devil's Canyon, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against hardpan earth that hadn't tasted rain in 3 months. Inside the lurching vehicle, 22-year-old Evangeline Mueller pressed her 12-year-old sister Nellie close against the cracked leather seat, her calloused fingers smoothing the child's auburn hair, while dust motes danced in shafts of light, streaming through bullet holes in the coach's wooden frame. The territory still bore fresh scars from Apache conflicts, silver mining booms, and the kind of violence that flourished where territorial law bent like green wood under the weight of corruption and greed. Evangeline had learned this truth the hard way over the past 6 months. Ever since her mother's lingering death from what the company doctor had called consumption, though the strange, bitter taste in her mother's final medicine still haunted her dreams like a poisonous whisper. More troubling still was her mother's final whispered words. "Trust the church people if something happens, Liebchen. The box is hidden where the Lord watches over us. Don't let them take what's yours." "Sind wir endlich sicher, Eva?" Nellie whispered in German, her voice barely audible over the thunder of hooves and creaking leather that filled the stifling coach interior. "English only now, Liebchen?" Evangeline murmured, forcing steadiness into her tone, despite the ice forming in her stomach like winter frost on a window pane. "We must disappear completely. No more German, no more looking back." Through the dust-caked window, she watched the landscape roll past in waves of sage and creosote, broken by towering red rock formations that seemed to watch their passage with ancient, unblinking eyes. Just 3 more hours to Tucson, where they could vanish into the anonymity of a growing city and start fresh with new names and a future that didn't include Gideon Franklin's suffocating grip around their throats. The other passengers a nervous merchant named Kowalski, who clutched a sample case like a shield against the world's cruelties, and an elderly widow called Mrs. Fletcher, whose carpetbag never left her gnarled hands, had maintained polite distance since boarding in Tombstone. Evangeline preferred it that way. Questions led to complications, and complications had nearly gotten them killed twice already during their desperate 3-day flight from Crow's Landing. The coach lurched, suddenly throwing them against the side as the driver's panicked shout cracked across the desert air like a whip. Riders coming hard from the rocks, armed men moving fast. Evangeline's pulse thundered against her throat as she glimpsed movement through the front window, 4 horsemen emerging from behind a cluster of barrel cacti like devils from the underworld, their faces masked by bandanas and their rifles glinting like deadly promises in the afternoon sun. Even before the lead rider removed his hat to reveal prematurely gray hair, she recognized the lean, predatory silhouette that had haunted her nightmares for months. Silas Murphy. Franklin's foreman had found them at last. "Stand and deliver, you miserable sons of bitches." Silas's voice cut through the air like a bullwhip, and the stage ground to a halt in a cloud of choking dust and snorting horses that pawed the ground with nervous energy. Evangeline's mouth went dry as desert sand. 3 days of careful flight, using every trick her mother had taught her about covering trails and avoiding detection, and they'd still been hunted down like animals by a man who seemed to possess supernatural tracking abilities. The fraudulent marriage certificate in Franklin's possession gave him legal authority to pursue his runaway wife across territorial lines. And Silas Murphy was exactly the kind of man who enjoyed exercising that authority with maximum brutality and professional satisfaction. "Everyone out hands where we can see 'em, or we start shooting innocent folk." The door wrenched open with a rusty screech that sounded like a scream of tortured metal, and Silas's cold gray eyes found Evangeline immediately like a snake finding its prey. Well, Mrs. Gideon Franklin, Your devoted husband's been mighty goddamn worried about his missing bride. Been losing sleep over your disappearance, he has. I am not his wife. Evangeline replied steadily, though her voice shook with suppressed fury that threatened to boil over. That ceremony was performed under false pretenses, and you know it as well as I do. Silas laughed a sound like grinding millstones that echoed off the surrounding rocks. Territorial court says different, lady. Got the papers right here, signed and sealed by Deputy Pierce himself. He patted his vest pocket with mock affection, as if caressing a lover's face. Makes you a thief for running off with Mr. Franklin's property. His gaze shifted to Nellie with calculating menace that made Evangeline's blood run cold. All of his property, including that little girl there. The other bandits, hard-faced men Evangeline recognized as guards from the Crow's Landing silver mine, began rifling through the passengers' belongings with professional efficiency that spoke of years of practice in the art of intimidation. The largest of them, a barrel-chested brute with scarred knuckles, everyone called Iron Hand, grabbed Mrs. Fletcher's carpetbag and dumped its meager contents onto the ground with unnecessary violence, coins, and personal items scattering like frightened birds. Please, the old woman begged, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks that had seen too much hardship already. That's everything I own in this world. Every last thing. Iron Hand backhanded her casually, the blow sending her sprawling into the dust with a sickening thud that made Evangeline flinch. Should have thought of that before you chose the wrong goddamn stage, Granny. Should have minded your own business. White-hot rage flared in Evangeline's chest as she started forward instinctively, but Silas caught her wrist in a grip that would leave purple bruises for days. His fingers were like iron bands, and she could smell whiskey and tobacco on his breath as he leaned close. Easy there, Mrs. Franklin. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to sweet little Nellie, would we? Accidents happen so easy out here in the desert, especially to children who don't have proper protection. The threat hung in the desert air, like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Evangeline forced herself to stillness, despite every instinct screaming at her to fight. Her mind raced through impossible calculations. They were at least 5 miles from the nearest ranch, with nothing but empty wasteland stretching to the horizon in every direction. The driver lay motionless in his seat. Whether unconscious or dead, she couldn't tell. Kowalski knelt with his hands pressed to his skull, blood seeping between his fingers, where a rifle butt had found its mark with brutal precision. Then, sharp as thunder in the crystalline air, a rifle shot cracked out from the rocky ridge above them. One of the bandits spun and dropped, clutching his shoulder and screaming as crimson soaked through his shirt like spilled wine. A second shot followed immediately, and Iron Hand's hat went flying, a neat hole punched through its battered crown as if by magic. "Scatter, you bastards!" Silas roared, releasing Evangeline and clawing for his holstered Colt with the desperate movements of a man suddenly finding himself prey instead of predator. From her position near the overturned stage, Evangeline caught a glimpse of their unexpected savior. A lone figure silhouetted against the azure sky, Winchester rifle steady against his shoulder, with the poise of a natural marksman. Apache by the long black hair bound with a red headband, and the fluid way he moved across the treacherous terrain like water flowing over stone. His clothing was a mixture of traditional buckskin and military blue that marked him as one of the scouts who walked the dangerous line between two worlds, trusted by neither but needed by both. 2 more shots cracked out in rapid succession, precise and deadly as clockwork. The bandits' horses reared and bolted in panic, and suddenly Silas was on foot cursing as he tried to calm his spooked mount, while bullets whistled around his head. The remaining guards scattered for whatever cover they could find behind rocks and scrub, but their positions were fatally exposed on the valley floor, like insects under a magnifying glass. "This ain't over, Apache bastard." Silas shouted toward the ridge, his voice hoarse with fury and frustration that bordered on madness. "You just signed your death warrant, and theirs too. Mr. Franklin's got a long memory and longer reach." But he vaulted onto his horse and spurted into a hard gallop anyway, the surviving bandits following in a cloud of dust and shattered pride that would take weeks to recover from. They left their wounded comrade writhing in the dirt, more concerned with their own skins than loyalty to fallen companions, a fact that spoke volumes about the kind of men Franklin employed. Silence settled over the scene like a burial shroud, broken only by the wheeze of wind through creosote branches and Mrs. Fletcher's quiet sobbing that sounded like a broken bird trying to sing. The Apache scout remained motionless on the ridge for several heartbeats, no doubt scanning for additional threats or signs of deception, with eyes that missed nothing. Then he began picking his way down the slope, with the fluid grace of someone completely at home. In this harsh country, every step calculated and sure. As he approached, Evangeline got her first clear look at their rescuer and felt something stir in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with the kind of lean, weathered build that spoke of countless miles traveled on foot and horseback across unforgiving terrain. His face was angular and intelligent, marked by sun and wind, but not yet lined by age, and his dark eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from surviving in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or foolish. The Winchester he carried was a Model 1873, the kind the Army issued to scouts who worked the boundaries between civilization and wilderness, men who understood that survival often depended on being able to kill quickly and accurately when talking failed. When he reached the overturned stage, he knelt beside the wounded bandit and quickly checked for concealed weapons before examining the man's shoulder wound with the professional competence of someone who had seen plenty of bullet holes in his time. The bullet had passed through cleanly missing bone and major blood vessels by what looked like divine providence. "You'll live if you don't do anything stupid," he told the bandit in accented but clear English, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Tell your boss the Apache scouts watch these roads. Tell him Dasan Running Bear sends his regards and suggests he find a new line of work." The wounded man nodded frantically and stumbled away into the desert, clutching his arm and casting fearful glances over his shoulder, as if expecting another bullet to find him at any moment. The scout Dasan turned his attention to the other passengers with professional efficiency that spoke of military training. Mrs. Fletcher had a bruised cheek and wounded pride, but no serious injuries beyond what her old bones had already endured. Kowalski's head wound looked worse than it was. Scalp cuts always bled dramatically, making minor injuries appear life-threatening. The driver stirred and groaned, proving he was alive, if not entirely coherent, muttering something about damned road agents and the stage line's claim. Through it all, Evangeline found herself studying this unexpected guardian angel, with growing fascination and something that might have been hope stirring in her chest for the first time in months. There was something in his bearing that suggested he'd walked between worlds for most of his life. Comfortable with violence when necessary, but not cruel by nature. When he moved to examine the stage's damaged wheel, she noticed how he avoided sudden gestures that might alarm the traumatized passengers, and how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for additional threats. He was preparing to leave, gathering his pinto pony's reins with the easy competence of a man accustomed to solitary travel, when desperation drove Evangeline forward like a physical force. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he melted back into the desert landscape like a ghost, and with him would go their only real hope of protection from Franklin's seemingly infinite reach. "Wait." The word escaped before she could reconsider the wisdom of what she was about to do or calculate the risks of trusting a stranger with their lives. Dasan paused, dark eyes meeting hers with the kind of directness that made her feel stripped of pretense and social pleasantries, as if he could see straight through to her soul and was weighing what he found there. "This close she could see the intelligence behind his weathered features, the way he assessed her and Nellie with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to reading people's intentions in split seconds and making life-or-death decisions based on those readings. Evangeline took a shaky breath that tasted of dust and desperation, and made her bargain with survival itself of the words her mother had taught her about frontier pragmatism echoing in her memory, like a prayer to pragmatic gods. I can cook, I can clean, I can be quiet. The offer came out as barely more than a whisper, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact, despite the humiliation of begging for protection, like a lost child. Just don't leave us here to die. For a moment that stretched like eternity under the blazing sun, he said nothing, and she could see him weighing possibilities with the careful consideration of a man who understood that mercy could be as dangerous as cruelty in this harsh land. The danger of traveling with white women in Apache country where his own people might kill him for harboring enemies. The complications that always came with refugees fleeing whatever violence had shattered their lives. The simple mathematics of survival in a land where resources were scarce and mistakes were often fatal. His gaze shifted to Nellie, taking in the child's frightened face and the way she pressed close to her sister's side, like a baby bird seeking shelter from a hawk's shadow. Something flickered in his expression, not softness exactly, but perhaps recognition of a responsibility he understood from his own harsh upbringing in a world that showed little mercy to orphans. Can you do all that while keeping up with a man who's being hunted by half the territory? He asked finally, his voice carrying traces of amusement beneath the practical assessment, as if he found something oddly refreshing about her directness. Try me. Evangeline replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice and the stubborn determination that had carried her this far. Dasan almost smiled at that, and she caught a glimpse of the man he might have been in a gentler world. You carry water without complaint and make no sound when I signal danger. We move fast and rest little. This country has a way of teaching hard lessons to the slow learners, and I don't have time to bury anyone who can't keep up. Relief flooded through Evangeline so suddenly, her knees nearly buckled, and she had to grab the stage wheel for support. Thank you. I swear on my mother's grave, we won't slow you down. Don't thank me yet, he said, shouldering his rifle and scanning the horizon for dust clouds that might signal pursuit. Thank me when you're still breathing at sunset. Right now we have maybe 1 hour before they bring more guns and better trackers to finish what they started. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions as Dasan led them away from the wrecked stage on September 15th, their small party moving single file through terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god to punish the unwary and kill the unprepared. The afternoon heat was beginning to break toward evening, but the rock still radiated enough stored warmth to create shimmering mirages that turned distant mesas into wavering phantoms that danced just beyond reach. Evangeline rode double with Nellie on the sturdy paint mare they'd taken from the bandits, a horse with good legs and the kind of calm temperament that suggested extensive training and careful handling. Mrs. Fletcher and Kowalski had chosen to wait with the stage driver for the next eastbound coach gambling. That Silas wouldn't return to a scene where federal marshals might already be investigating the attack and asking uncomfortable questions. They're making a fatal mistake, Dasan observed when Evangeline mentioned their decision, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had seen too much of human nature's darker side. Silas Murphy doesn't leave witnesses to testify against him in federal court. They'll be crow food by morning, and their deaths will be blamed on Apache raiders who conveniently disappear before any investigation can begin. The casual certainty in his voice sent ice through Evangeline's veins, but she didn't argue with his assessment. Her mother had warned her that frontier justice was often no justice at all, and the past 6 months had taught her that legal documents could be more dangerous than loaded guns in the hands of corrupt men who understood how to manipulate the system. Dasan set a punishing pace across broken country that would have challenged experienced cavalry following game trails and dry washes that offered concealment from distant observers while still allowing relatively swift travel. He moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent his life reading the desert's subtle language, the story written in disturbed pebbles and bent grass in the way the wind carried scents and the manner in which birds took flight from hidden roosts when danger approached. "Your sister needs water more than you think," he said during their first brief rest in the shade of a towering saguaro cactus, noting how Nellie's lips were already showing the telltale whiteness of dehydration despite their short travel time. "Small sips like a bird drinking. The body uses it better that way, and we can't afford to waste a single drop." Evangeline nodded gratefully, accepting guidance that might mean the difference between life and death in this harsh environment. She had read about desert survival in newspapers and dime novels, but the reality was far harsher than any written account had prepared her for. The sun seemed to leach moisture from her body with every breath, and the alkaline dust coating everything made her skin feel tight and raw, as old leather left too long in the elements. "How far do we have to travel?" she asked, sharing the precious water with Nellie exactly as instructed, while trying not to think about how quickly their supply would disappear. "Far enough?" Dasan replied, studying their back trail through field glasses borrowed from the abandoned stage. "Safety's not a place you reach. It's something you carry with you through wisdom and preparation. Right now, we're carrying very little of either." As they traveled deeper into the Badlands, Evangeline began to understand the complexity of her rescuer's position in this harsh borderland where different cultures collided like tectonic plates grinding against each other with potentially explosive results. When they encountered a cavalry patrol near Willow Springs on the evening of September 16th, 6 dusty soldiers led by a grizzled sergeant whose uniform bore the stains of hard desert service, Dasan's entire bearing changed like a man putting on a mask. He sat straighter in his saddle, his face becoming an unreadable mask, as the patrol leader approached with the cautious wariness of men who had learned not to trust anyone or anything in this unforgiving country. Dasan Running Bear, Apache Scout 3rd Cavalry. He announced, formally producing a water-stained paper from his shirt pocket with movements that were carefully slow and non-threatening. Escorting civilians to safety after bandit attack on the stagecoach on the Tucson line, Silas Murphy and associates traveling with forged territorial documents. The sergeant, a weathered Irishman named O'Brien, whose accent still carried traces of County Cork despite decades in America, examined the document with the skeptical air of a man who had dealt with too many questionable papers in his 20 years of frontier service. His pale blue eyes missed nothing as they took in the exhausted condition of Evangeline and Nellie, the way they clung together like survivors of a shipwreck. "Heard there was trouble near Devil's Canyon." O'Brien set his voice, carrying the careful neutrality of a professional soldier who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of territorial politics. "You ladies wouldn't happen to be the ones that mining fellow Franklin's been asking about, would you got word from Deputy Pierce that his wife ran off with their ward child, might be traveling with hostile Indians?" Evangeline's stomach clenched like a fist around broken glass, but she forced herself to speak calmly, despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly. "I am not Mr. Franklin's wife, Sergeant. The marriage was performed under duress and false pretenses. I have documentation proving my legal guardianship of my sister, if you'll allow me to show it to you." "That's a matter for the territorial courts to decide, ma'am," O'Brien replied, though his tone had grown less hostile as he studied their faces and saw something there that didn't match the description of dangerous fugitives he'd been given. "But I'll tell you this much, that mining camps got more crooked lawyers than a dog's got fleas, and most of them draw their pay from the company store. Makes a man wonder who's telling the truth and who's got reasons to lie. Like coyotes following a wounded deer. Dasan added quietly, his comment drawing a sharp look from the sergeant, but also a grudging nod of understanding from a man who had seen enough corruption to recognize it when it walked upright and wore a badge. After the patrol moved on, Dasan was quiet for a long time, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with increased vigilance, as if expecting to see dust clouds that might signal pursuit or betrayal. Finally, as they made camp in a shallow arroyo sheltered by overhanging sandstone that provided both concealment and protection from the cold desert wind, he spoke again. "Tell me about this marriage you say was false," he said, settling cross-legged beside their small fire while keeping his rifle within easy reach. "And don't leave out anything that might get us killed later." Evangeline hesitated, then decided that complete honesty was the only currency that would buy continued protection from a man who held their lives in his capable hands. As she prepared their simple evening meal from hardtack beans and a bit of salt pork that would have to sustain them through another day of hard travel, she told him everything, how her mother's death from what the company doctor called consumption had left them vulnerable as newborn lambs in a world full of wolves. "The strange thing was," she said, stirring beans over their small fire, while Nellie dozed fitfully nearby, wrapped in Dasan's spare blanket against the desert cold, "my mother's cough got worse after she started taking that special medicine Franklin's doctor prescribed. She said it tasted bitter like metal shavings. But she kept taking it because the doctor said it was her only hope of recovery." Something flickered in Dasan's eyes at this detail, but he remained silent as she continued with the story that had shaped their desperate flight across half the territory. The ceremony was rushed. She went on, her voice growing harder as she remembered the humiliation and deception. "Deputy Pierce's office, 2 witnesses who worked for Franklin. I signed papers I wasn't allowed to read, first trusting they were employment contracts as promised. Only later did I discover I'd actually signed a marriage certificate that gave Franklin legal control over everything I owned and everyone I loved. The fraudulent marriage had legally bound her to Franklin and given him control over both her labor and Nellie's custody under territorial property laws that treated wives and children as possessions rather than people with rights and dreams of their own. He said if I tried to leave, the courts would take Nellie away as an unfit guardian." She finished, her voice tight with remembered helplessness that still made her hands shake with rage. A runaway wife with no means of support, abandoning her Christian duties to chase after wild Indians and dangerous ideas about women's independence. Dasan poked at the fire with a mesquite stick, his weathered face thoughtful in the flickering light that cast dancing shadows across the canyon walls. "The guardianship papers your mother signed, where are they now?" "Hidden in Black Mesa with Father Martinez at the Mission Church. Mama knew something was wrong in those final weeks. She kept asking me questions about Franklin, about the job offer, about territorial marriage laws." Evangeline's voice caught slightly as she remembered her mother's growing desperation and the way she'd pressed a small key into her hand just days before dying. She was trying to protect us, even while the poison was eating her alive from the inside. "Smart woman," Dasan observed, and something in his tone suggested he understood more about poison than most people had reason to know. "Church records are harder to steal or forge than government papers. Like hiding water in solid rock, only someone who knows where to look can find it, and even then, they need the right tools." As the desert air began to cool with approaching darkness, and the first stars appeared like scattered diamonds in the vast sky above them, Dasan shared fragments of his own story in the economical phrases of a man unaccustomed to revealing personal details to strangers. He had been born into the Chiricahua Apache, but orphaned young when soldiers raided his village during the brutal conflicts of the 1860s that had left scars on both races that might never heal. A white family took me in, raised me as their own," he said, staring into the fire, as if seeing faces there that existed only in memory. "They taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about who you choose to protect when the shooting starts and the easy choices disappear." The simple honesty of his words hit Evangeline harder than any romantic declaration could have, cutting through her carefully maintained defenses and touching something deep inside her that had been wounded by months of betrayal and fear. This man who owed them nothing and could have ridden away without a backward glance had chosen to risk everything to keep them safe, for reasons that had nothing to do with obligation or payment. "My parents were killed when soldiers raided our village," he continued quietly. "I was 8 years old, hiding in a root cellar while my world burned around me. The white family, the Morrisons, they could have turned me over to the reservation agents, collected the bounty money, and gone about their lives. Instead, they gave me a home, an education, and a chance to make something of myself in a world that wanted to see me dead or broken. What happened to them?" Evangeline asked, though she dreaded the answer from the way his shoulders tensed. "Apache raiders killed them 3 years later," Dasan said, with the flat tone of a man who had made peace with tragedies that could never be undone. "Different band, different reasons, but just as dead. Taught me that hatred travels in circles like water flowing downhill. It always finds a way to come back and destroy what you love most." That night, they slept in shifts beneath the immense desert sky, the Milky Way spreading overhead like scattered flour on a baker's dark cloth, while coyotes sang their ancient songs in the distance. When it was Evangeline's turn to rest, Dasan offered her his wool serape against the cold that came with altitude and clear skies, settling himself nearby with his rifle across his knees and his eyes constantly scanning the empty landscape for signs of pursuit. She found herself acutely aware of his presence as he sat upright, like a guardian spirit, and the steady rhythm of his breathing and the way he moved his head to catch sounds that her city-bred ears couldn't detect. When Nellie woke crying softly from a nightmare about Iron Hand's scarred face and violent hands, Evangeline moved closer to Dasan's solid warmth to comfort her sister, and for just a moment felt something that might have been safety in a world gone mad with greed and violence. "Sleep," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the moonlit terrain that stretched endlessly in all directions. "I'll watch over you both. The desert has many ears, but I know how to listen to its whispers." For the first time since fleeing Crow's Landing, Evangeline actually managed to rest without nightmares of pursuit and capture haunting her dreams. Dawn on September 18th brought them to the ramshackle settlement of Cinder, Bluff, where a telegraph line connected isolated ranches and mining claims to the outside world. Like a spider's web of copper wire, carrying news and lies with equal efficiency. The town consisted of little more than a trading post, a blacksmith's forge, a small schoolhouse, and a few adobe buildings clustered around a central well that provided the only reliable water for 20 miles in any direction. Dasan had hoped to arrange eastbound passage for the sisters on a freight wagon, putting distance between them and Franklin's territorial authority, while giving them time to plan their next move. But as they approached the settlement in the gray pre-dawn light, it became clear that safety remained as elusive as morning mist in the desert heat. Dust clouds coming from the south. Dasan observed, studying the horizon through his field glasses, with the focused intensity of a hunter who had suddenly realized he might be the prey. 4 riders moving fast and following our trail like bloodhounds. They've got our scent now, and they're not going to give up easily. Evangeline's chest tightened with familiar dread as she recognized the implications. "How long do we have?" "Maybe an hour, if we're lucky, less if they push their horses hard. We need supplies and information before they arrive. and we need to find out if there are any honest people left in this territory, willing to stand up to Franklin's money and threats. They entered Cinder Bluff, cautiously leading their horses down the main street, while Dasan evaluated escape routes and defensive positions with the professional eye of someone who had survived countless ambushes by staying one step ahead of those who wanted him dead. The schoolteacher, a woman in her 30s named Margaret Chen, was hanging laundry behind the schoolhouse when she noticed their approach, and something in her intelligent eyes suggested she saw more than most people bothered to notice. Margaret was one of the educated women who had come west to bring civilization to the frontier, practical, intelligent, and possessed of the quiet courage it took to live alone in such isolated country, where a woman's safety depended on her wits and the respect she could command from rough men who often saw female independence as either a curiosity or a challenge. Her mixed Chinese and Irish heritage marked her as someone who understood what it meant to exist between worlds, fighting for acceptance from people who would never quite see her as belonging to either culture completely. "You folks look like you've been riding hard through hell's back 40, she said, drying her hands on her apron while studying their exhausted condition with the keen eye of someone accustomed to reading the signs of trouble. "My cousin Whispering Fox passed through here yesterday. Tracker for hire works for whoever pays best. Said there were men asking questions about travelers matching your description, offering good money for information. Looking for passage east." Dasan replied carefully, his voice neutral, but his eyes alert to every nuance of her expression. "The ladies need to reach Tucson safely, and we're hoping to avoid any unnecessary complications along the way." Margaret's sharp eyes missed nothing about their desperate condition, and the way Evangeline held Nellie protectively close, the careful manner in which Dasan positioned himself to watch all approaches and the subtle signs of people who had been running hard from something that terrified them more than the dangers of desert travel. "Freight wagon's not due for another week," she said, then lowered her voice and glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard by potential informants. "But you're welcome to water your horses and rest in the shade. Schoolhouse has a root cellar that's cool and private if you need it, and I've got a fair collection of books that might help pass the time while you wait for things to settle down." That was when Silas Murphy and his men rode into town like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, their arrival announced by the thunder of hoofbeats and a cloud of dust that seemed to darken the morning sun. They came in hard horses lathered with sweat and foam from being pushed beyond their limits, weapons prominently displayed in the casual manner of men accustomed to intimidating honest folk into submission through the simple threat of violence. Silas had added a 4th man to his group, the same Paiute tracker Margaret had mentioned, Whispering Fox, whose ability to follow sign across bare rock was legendary throughout the territory, and whose services could be bought by anyone willing to pay his substantial fees. "Morning, good people of Cinder Bluff," Silas called out as he dismounted near the trading post, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman who knew his product was poison but sold it anyway, with a smile and a handshake. "We're looking for some dangerous fugitives who've been terrorizing honest folks throughout the territory. Cold-blooded murderers who attacked a stagecoach and killed innocent passengers in their lust for blood and gold." The lie was delivered with practiced smoothness that spoke of years spent bending the truth to serve his purposes. But Evangeline noticed how the townspeople instinctively stepped back from the armed men, creating a circle of empty space around them like a protective barrier. Frontier settlements survived by avoiding trouble, and Silas's group radiated the kind of threat that could destroy a community's fragile peace in minutes if they decided to make an example of someone. From his saddlebags, Silas produced 2 items that made Evangeline's blood run cold as mountain snow. The first was a wanted poster bearing a crude but recognizable sketch of Dasan offering $50 for his capture on charges of murder and horse theft crimes that carried the death penalty in territorial courts, where judges were often more concerned with maintaining order than pursuing justice. The second was an official-looking document bearing Deputy Pierce's territorial seal. It's heavy paper and elaborate stamps designed to impress people who couldn't read the legal language hidden beneath the impressive presentation. "This here's a marriage certificate," Silas announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying across the settlement like a town crier, bringing news of disaster and death. "Legal and binding, filed with the territorial government in proper fashion, according to all established laws and procedures. Proves that woman there is Mrs. Gideon Franklin, lawful wife of the most respected businessman in 3 counties, and mother to that little girl by virtue of legal adoption." He held up the document so everyone could see the official stamps and signatures that gave it the appearance of legitimacy, even as Evangeline recognized the forged handwriting that had trapped her in a web of legal deception. Now Mrs. Franklin ran off with her husband's ward that little girl there, and they've been aided by this murderous Apache renegade who's wanted for crimes that would make decent folks sick to their stomachs. We're here to bring them home safe and see justice done according to territorial law and Christian morality. Margaret Chen stepped forward, her schoolteacher's training evident in the way she examined the documents with scholarly thoroughness that made Silas shift uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "These papers look authentic enough," she admitted reluctantly. "But that doesn't prove anything about murder or children being in any kind of real danger." Iron Hand, the scarred brute who served as Silas's chief enforcer, spat tobacco juice into the dust at Margaret's feet with deliberate disrespect. "You calling us liars, you yellow bitch. Maybe you need a lesson in showing proper respect to white men who are trying to do their Christian duty." "No. I'm saying innocent people don't run from justice unless they have damn good reason to fear what passes for law in these parts," Margaret replied steadily, though Evangeline could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hand moved slightly closer to the small pistol she probably carried for protection. The confrontation might have escalated into gunplay that would have left innocent people dead in the street, but Dassan's calm voice cut through the building hostility like a knife through butter, drawing everyone's attention with the quiet authority of a man who understood how to diffuse dangerous situations before they exploded. "Papers are easy to forge when you own the deputy who signs them," he observed in a conversational tone that somehow made the accusation more damning than if he'd shouted it. "Like putting a wolf's hide on a sheep looks dangerous from a distance, but underneath it's still just wool and fear." Silas's hand dropped to his gun butt, fingers twitching with barely restrained violence that promised death to anyone who challenged his authority. "You want to repeat that accusation, Apache bastard? Because I'd be happy to give you a chance to back up your words with steel. Just stating what any fool with eyes can see." Dassan replied, his own hands remaining relaxed at his sides, though Evangeline noticed how he had positioned himself to draw and fire in one fluid motion if the situation deteriorated beyond the point of peaceful resolution. Territorial law says a woman can't be forced to return to an abusive marriage, even with legal documents that look official to people who can't read the fine print. "Ain't nothing about abuse in these papers." Silas snarled, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the brutal man beneath who solved problems with violence and intimidation rather than law and reason. "Just a runaway wife who needs to come home and accept her Christian duties like a proper woman instead of running around the desert with savages and degenerates." From her position near the schoolhouse, Margaret passed Evangeline a small folded paper with the stealth of someone accustomed to operating under the watchful eyes of those who might not approve of her activities. Written in neat schoolteacher handwriting were the words, "I believe you. Root cellar after dark. Bring any proof you have. My cousin isn't what he seems." That simple gesture of faith from a stranger gave Evangeline hope that someone in this isolated place might be willing to help them fight Franklin's web of legal corruption and systematic intimidation. But before she could respond or even fully process the implications of Margaret's cryptic message about her cousin, a rifle shot cracked out across the settlement like thunder from a clear sky. The bullet shattered a whiskey bottle on the trading post porch, sending glass flying and horses rearing in alarm, while the sharp report echoed off the surrounding hills like the voice of an angry god. Iron Hand had fired into the air. As a warning, his scarred face twisted in a satisfied grin that spoke of a man who enjoyed terrorizing the innocent almost as much as he enjoyed the money Franklin paid him for his services. "Enough goddamn talking," he growled, working the lever to chamber another round, while his eyes swept the crowd for anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. "We're taking the woman and child back where they belong. Anyone who objects can discuss it with my Winchester here, and I guarantee it's a conversation they won't enjoy." Dasan moved faster than Evangeline would have thought humanly possible, his reflexes honed by years of survival, in a world where hesitation meant death. In one fluid motion, he grabbed her around the waist and pulled her down behind a wooden water trough, his body shielding hers as more shots rang out, and bullets splinted wood around them like deadly rain. The sensation of being pressed against his solid frame sent an unexpected jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. Profound awareness of strength and protection. In a world gone mad with violence, the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes, the steady beat of his heart against her back as he returned fire with deadly precision. She could feel his pulse thundering against his ribs in time with her own smell, the gunpowder and dessert dust that filled the air around them, hear him counting shots and estimating positions with the professional calm of someone who had survived countless firefights by staying one step ahead of death. "Stay down," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear, as he drew his Colt and returned fire with surgical precision that spoke of extensive military training. "When I say move, you run for the schoolhouse, and don't look back no matter what you hear behind you." The brief gunfight was fierce, but short-lived, a few minutes of chaos that seemed to stretch for hours while bullets flew and innocent people dove for cover wherever they could find it. Dasan's shots were precisely placed, one shattering Iron Hand's gun hand and sending his rifle spinning into the dust, another forcing Whispering Fox to dive for cover behind a hitching post, where he stayed down with the survival instincts of a man who understood when discretion was the better part of valor. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in everyone's ears began to fade, Silas found himself facing not just an Apache scout, but half a dozen armed townspeople who had decided they didn't appreciate being terrorized by outside gunmen who threatened their women and children in broad daylight. "This ain't over, you red bastard," Silas snarled as he helped the wounded Iron Hand into his saddle, blood streaming down the man's arm from shattered fingers that would never hold a gun quite the same way again. "We'll be back with federal authority and proper warrants. The kind of papers even bleeding heart school marms and Indian lovers will have to respect." As the outlaws rode away in a cloud of dust and muttered threats that promised future violence, Margaret approached the water trough, where Dasan and Evangeline still crouched in the aftermath of gunfire, her face grave with knowledge that went beyond what any schoolteacher should have needed to learn. "You folks need to disappear from here fast," she said urgently, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard by potential informants who might sell information for the price of a bottle of whiskey. "They'll be back with more men and legal warrants that even decent people will be forced to honor, no matter what they personally believe about right and wrong." Evangeline looked up at Dasan, seeing her own desperation reflected in his dark eyes, like images in a mirror that showed too much truth. "Where can we go? Franklin's influence reaches across half the territory, and he's got the law on his side, no matter how corrupt it might be. Old Crow's camp is still our best option," Dasan replied after a moment of consideration, weighing their limited choices against the very real possibility of death if they made the wrong decision. 2 days north through hard country, that'll test every skill we possess, but they'll honor sanctuary if we can reach them alive. Like finding shelter in a storm, you go where the wind can't reach, even if the path is treacherous. That evening, hidden in Margaret's root cellar like fugitives from justice, Evangeline learned the first crucial piece of information that would shape their desperate flight across the most dangerous territory in the American Southwest. Margaret had been quietly documenting suspicious activities around Deputy Pierce's office for months, and what she'd discovered painted a disturbing picture of corruption that reached far beyond simple graft and bribery. Pierce has been taking bribes for years, Margaret explained, showing them carefully copied documents that she'd hidden beneath the floorboards of her schoolhouse like treasure maps, leading to dangerous truths. But there's something else that's been bothering me. Other women have gone missing after marrying into mining families throughout the territory. Widows mostly, or women with valuable property, and no male relatives to protect their interests. How many? Evangeline asked, though she dreaded the answer and the implications it carried for their own situation. At least a dozen in the past 3 years scattered across Arizona and New Mexico territories. All of them had property or mineral rights that somehow ended up transferred to mining companies after they disappeared. The official records show they either died of natural causes or simply abandoned their claims and moved back east, but none of their families ever heard from them again. It was then that Margaret revealed the family connection that would prove crucial in the days ahead, information that cast Whispering Fox's presence with Silas's group in an entirely different light. My mother was Chinese, but my father was Irish. She explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to navigate between worlds that often viewed her as belonging to neither. I have cousins on both sides of the family, including some who married into the local Paiute bands back when such things were more common and less frowned upon by territorial authorities. That tracker working for Silas, he's family distant, but family nonetheless. And I know him well enough to recognize when he's playing a role for reasons that go deeper than money. What do you mean? Dasan asked his military training, making him instantly alert to the possibility of deception and hidden agendas that could get them all killed. Whispering Fox is one of the best trackers in the territory, but he's also got a conscience that sometimes conflicts with his need to earn money for his people. Margaret explained. Sometimes blood runs thicker than gold, especially when innocent children are involved in whatever game the adults are playing. They left Cinder Bluff before dawn, on September 19th, following Dasan through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous with each mile they put between themselves and what passed for civilization in this harsh land. Their destination was Black Mesa, where Evangeline's mother had hidden something that might prove Franklin's corruption and provide them with the legal ammunition they needed to fight back against his systematic campaign of intimidation and fraud. But the journey would test them in ways none of them could have imagined, pushing their physical endurance and mental resolve to the breaking point, while pursued by men who would stop at nothing to drag them back to face Franklin's version of territorial justice. The incident that nearly ended their flight came on September 21st, as they traveled through a region of wind-carved sandstone formations that provided both concealment and deadly danger for the unwary. They had stopped at an isolated way station, little more than a one-room cabin beside a natural spring, to rest their horses and refill their water supplies with the precious liquid that meant the difference between life and death in the desert. The station keeper, a grizzled prospector named Jake Morrison, who claimed to have been working claims in the area for 15 years, seemed friendly enough at first encounter. He offered them coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of burnt dirt, asked casual questions about their travels that seemed motivated by loneliness rather than suspicion, and even offered to sell them supplies at prices that were merely outrageous rather than completely ruinous. But Dasan's instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile territory, where a moment's inattention could mean a bullet in the back, picked up on subtle signs of deception that would have escaped most people's notice. The way Morrison's eyes lingered a fraction too long on their faces, as if memorizing details for later description. the fresh horse droppings in his corral, despite his claims of not seeing travelers in weeks. The slight bulge under his shirt that suggested a concealed weapon worn by a man expecting trouble. "Something's not right about this place," he murmured to Evangeline as they prepared to leave, his voice pitched low enough that Morrison couldn't overhear from where he stood pretending to tend his horses. "That man's been watching us too carefully, asking too many questions, and he's got resources that don't match his story about being a lonely prospector." They were saddling their mounts when Morrison's true nature revealed itself with the sudden violence that characterized so many encounters in this lawless territory. 3 armed men emerged from concealment behind the cabin and outbuildings, more of Franklin's hired guns who had been positioned at way stations throughout the region like spiders waiting in their webs for unwary flies. "Real sorry about this, folks," Morrison said with mock regret that fooled no one, his weathered face revealing the calculating expression of a man who had sold his soul for money and found the transaction surprisingly easy. "But Mr. Franklin pays a lot better than hospitality and Christian charity, and a man's got to look out for his own interests in this hard country." What followed was a desperate chase through the maze of sandstone canyons that surrounded the way station, with Dasan using every trick he knew to evade their pursuers while protecting his charges from men who would have no qualms about shooting a child if it served their purposes. The narrow passages and towering walls created a natural labyrinth where echoes distorted sound and shadows concealed deadly threats around every turn. At one point, they were forced to abandon their horses and continue on foot through a passage barely wide enough for their shoulders, with bullets chipping stone around them, and the sound of pursuit echoing off the canyon walls like the voices of demons pursuing lost souls. The physical exertion was brutal, crawling through spaces that scraped skin from their backs, climbing rock faces that would have challenged experienced mountaineers, and running across terrain that punished every misstep with the possibility of a broken ankle, or worse. It was during this frantic flight that Evangeline first truly understood the depth of Dasan's capabilities and the extent to which their survival depended on skills she was only beginning to appreciate. He moved through the treacherous terrain with an almost supernatural awareness of every shadow, every sound, every potential threat or route of escape. When Nellie stumbled and twisted her ankle on loose rock that gave way under her weight, he carried her without complaint, while still maintaining their punishing pace, and somehow managing to watch their back trail for signs of immediate pursuit. "You're hurt," Evangeline observed when they finally found temporary safety in a hidden cave that Dasan seemed to know about from previous travels through the region. Dasan had taken a bullet graze across his left shoulder during their escape, though he'd given no sign of the wound until they stopped moving, and she noticed the blood soaking through his shirt. The wound was shallow, but painful, a red furrow across muscle that would need cleaning and bandaging to prevent infection in the desert heat. "It's nothing serious," he said. But she could see the pain in his eyes and the way he favored that arm when he thought she wasn't looking. Without being asked or waiting for permission, Evangeline tore strips from her cotton petticoat to clean and bind the wound with hands that were steadier than she had any right to expect under the circumstances. As she worked carefully cleaning away dirt and dried blood, she found herself acutely aware of the solid warmth of his skin and the way his muscles tensed under her touch, and the trust he showed in allowing her to tend his injury without question or complaint. The physical intimacy was born of necessity rather than romance, but it created a connection between them that went deeper than mere gratitude or temporary alliance. Here was a man who had risked his life for strangers, who continued to protect them despite being wounded in their defense, and who trusted her enough to let down his guard for the few minutes it took to tend his injury. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly as she tied off the makeshift bandage, her voice barely audible in the small cave where they huddled like refugees from a war that seemed to follow them wherever they went. "Really doing this, I mean." You could have left us at the stage and been safely back to your army duties by now, with no one questioning your actions or demanding explanations. Dasan was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape visible through the cave entrance. His dark eyes reflecting thoughts and memories that she could only guess at from the shadows that crossed his weathered features. My parents were killed when soldiers raided our village during the Apache wars. He said finally, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had made peace with tragedies that could never be undone or forgotten. I was 8 years old, hiding in a root cellar while my world burned around me, and everyone I loved died screaming for mercy that never came. He paused, and she could see him struggling with memories that still had the power to cause pain, despite the years that had passed since those terrible events. The Morrison family found me 3 days later, more dead than alive from thirst and terror. They could have turned me over to the reservation agents, collected the bounty money, and gone about their lives without another thought. Instead, they took me in, raised me as their own son, gave me an education and a chance to make something of myself in a world that wanted to see me dead or broken. What happened to them? Evangeline asked, though she dreaded the answer from the way his shoulders tensed and his hands clenched into fists. Apache raiders killed them 3 years later, Dasan said with brutal honesty that cut through any romantic notions about noble savages or innocent victims. Different band, different reasons, but just as dead. Taught me that hatred travels in circles like water flowing downhill. It always finds a way to come back and destroy what you love most, unless someone has the courage to step outside the circle and choose a different path. The simple honesty of his words hit Evangeline harder than any romantic declaration could have, cutting through her carefully maintained defenses and touching something deep inside her that had been wounded by months of betrayal and systematic deception. This man who owed them nothing and could have ridden away without a backward glance had chosen to risk everything to keep them safe, for reasons that had nothing to do with obligation payment or even basic human decency. The Morrisons taught me that family isn't just about blood. He continued, his voice growing stronger as he worked through the memories that had shaped his understanding of loyalty and responsibility. It's about who you choose to protect when the shooting starts and the easy choices disappear. It's about standing up for people who can't protect themselves, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted from life. That night they slept in shifts beneath a ceiling of stone, while coyotes sang their ancient songs in the distance, and the desert wind whispered secrets through the canyon walls. When it was Evangeline's turn to rest, Dasan offered her his wool serape against the cold that came with altitude and clear skies, settling himself nearby with his rifle across his knees and his eyes constantly scanning the cave entrance for signs of pursuit or other threats. She found herself acutely aware of his presence as he sat upright, like a guardian spirit, watching over their small family, the steady rhythm of his breathing that somehow made the world seem less dangerous, and the way he moved his head to catch sounds that her city-bred ears couldn't detect. When Nellie woke crying softly from a nightmare about Iron Hand's scarred face and violent hands, Evangeline moved closer to Dasan's solid warmth to comfort her sister, and for just a moment felt something that might have been safety in a world gone mad with greed and violence. "Sleep," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the moonlit terrain that stretched endlessly beyond their temporary refuge. "I'll watch over you both tonight. The desert has many ears and sees everything that moves, but I know how to listen to its whispers and read the signs it leaves for those who understand its language." For the first time since fleeing Crow's Landing, Evangeline actually managed to rest without nightmares of pursuit and capture haunting her dreams, though she woke several times to find Dasan exactly where he had been when she closed her eyes, keeping his solitary vigil with the patience of a man who understood that vigilance was the price of survival. in this harsh land. They reached Black Mesa on the evening of September 23rd, after days of hard travel through some of the most inhospitable country in the American Southwest terrain, and that seemed designed by a malevolent God to test every aspect of human endurance and determination. The mission church stood like a weathered sentinel against the star-filled sky, its adobe walls bearing the scars of decades spent enduring desert winds, occasional Apache raids, and the slow erosion of time that wore down even the strongest human constructions. Father Martinez had been dead for 3 months, they discovered upon their arrival. But his replacement, an earnest young priest named Father Antonio, who had come west with dreams of bringing salvation to the frontier, had preserved all the mission's records with the meticulous care that characterized the Catholic Church's approach to documentation and historical preservation. More importantly, for their immediate purposes, he remembered Evangeline's mother well and had been expecting their arrival with the patience of a man who understood that divine providence often worked through seemingly coincidental events. She came here often in her final months, Father Antonio said, as he unlocked the heavy wooden chest that contained the mission's official papers, his accent carrying traces of his native Spain, despite years spent learning to speak English with the precision required for legal documents. She seemed deeply troubled by something, asked many questions about territorial law, women's rights, and the legal protections available to widows and orphans under both civil and canon law. The guardianship document was exactly where it should have been written in Father Martinez's careful script and witnessed by 2 respected members of the congregation whose signatures could be verified independently by anyone who cared to investigate the matter thoroughly. But it was the other items hidden in a secret compartment of the chest that provided the shocking revelations that would change everything Evangeline thought she knew about her mother's death and Franklin's long-term plans. Hidden beneath false bottom of the wooden chest was a small metal box containing items that made Evangeline's world tilt sideways with the force of terrible understanding. There was a glass vial half full of white crystalline powder that seemed to glow with malevolent purpose in the lamplight. A photograph that made her breath catch in her throat and her knees threatened to buckle. And a letter written in her mother's own handwriting that revealed the full scope of Franklin's betrayal with devastating clarity. The photograph showed her mother standing beside Gideon Franklin and Deputy Pierce in front of what appeared to be a mining claim office, all 3 of them smiling as if they were the best of friends, rather than predator and prey. Her mother was holding a document and appeared healthy and vibrant, nothing like the wasted woman Evangeline remembered from those final, terrible weeks. But it was what was written on the back of the photograph in her mother's distinctive European handwriting that revealed the full magnitude of Franklin's calculated deception. March 15, 1879. GF promised equal partnership in new mining venture and legal protection for both girls after showing me documentation proving Nellie's father left us valuable mineral rights before his death. Signed preliminary agreement in good faith. But something is wrong with the medicine his doctor prescribed for my cough makes me weaker instead of stronger and tastes like metal shavings. If anything happens to me, Ava must know I was not fooled by a clever man. I was murdered by someone I trusted with our lives and future. Arsenic, Dassan said grimly after examining the contents of the vial with the knowledge of a man who had seen poison used as a weapon before. Small doses administered over time cause exactly the symptoms your mother described, wasting away persistent cough, gradual weakness, that mimics natural illness. A favorite method for people who want murder to look like natural death. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Hidden in another compartment was a detailed map showing mining claims and ranch properties throughout Arizona and New Mexico territories, marked with names and dates that corresponded to suspicious deaths and property transfers spanning several years. The scope of Franklin's operation was staggering hundreds of thousands of acres of valuable land, acquired through systematic murder disguised as medical treatment, legal manipulation, and the corruption of territorial officials. Your mother managed to copy this from Franklin's private files. Father Antonio explained, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge that no priest should have needed to carry. She gained access to his office when she went to sign what she thought were partnership papers. But what she discovered there made her realize the true nature of his business operations. The map told a story of calculated evil that extended far beyond simple greed or territorial corruption. Franklin had identified vulnerable families throughout the Southwest, widows with valuable property, immigrants who didn't understand American legal systems, people with mineral rights, who lacked the political connections to protect themselves from systematic fraud. Each mark on the map represented a life destroyed, a family scattered, a future stolen by a man who viewed human beings as nothing more than obstacles to be removed in pursuit of wealth and power. It was then that Whispering Fox stepped out of the shadows near the altar. But instead of the violence and capture they had expected, he carried Apache pictographs painted on strips of bark, a traditional method of communication that predated written language by countless generations and carried the authority of ancient customs that transcended the petty concerns of territorial politics. "Stormwater comes from the northern mountains," he said in heavily accented but clear English, translating the symbols for their benefit with the careful precision of someone delivering a message that could mean the difference between life and death. "Canyon floods begin tomorrow night, when the rains reach the narrow places. Silas plans to trap you at Devil's Gate, where the water has no escape and the walls are too high to climb." His sudden shift in allegiance became clear as he explained his true relationship to Margaret Chen and his growing disgust with the brutality he had witnessed during his reluctant service with Silas's band of killers. "I owe life debt to teacher woman's family." He explained, his weathered face showing the conflict between competing obligations that had torn at his conscience for weeks. "Her grandfather saved my father from cavalry patrol 20 winters ago, gave him horse and rifle when his own people had nothing. Cannot repay sacred debt by helping evil men harm women and children, no matter how much gold they offer." The pictographs revealed Silas's strategy in disturbing detail that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of the terrain around Devil's Gate. Flash floods were common in the narrow slot canyons during the autumn storm season, when sudden downpours in the distant mountains sent walls of water rushing through passages that could rise from ankle-deep to 20 feet in a matter of minutes. Silas planned to drive them into the natural bottleneck, where the rising water would eliminate both witnesses and evidence, allowing Franklin's conspiracy to continue without the inconvenience of federal investigations or awkward questions from honest authorities. "How long do we have?" Dawson asked, studying the pictographs with the eye of someone who understood both the desert's seasonal patterns and the tactical implications of being caught in a flash flood with armed men controlling the high ground. "Stormwater reaches Main Canyon tomorrow at sunset." Whispering Fox replied, his voice heavy with the urgency of their situation and the knowledge that he was betraying his employers for reasons that went deeper than money or tribal loyalty. But Silas already moves men into position like hunters driving deer toward a cliff. No way out except through Devil's Gate itself, and he controls the high ground like an eagle watching for prey. The revelation transformed their situation from a running battle into a desperate race against both human enemies and natural forces that could kill them just as effectively as bullets, but with far less chance of fighting back or negotiating their way to safety. The evidence they had gathered proved that Franklin was not just a corrupt businessman, but a systematic murderer who had built his fortune on the bodies of innocent people. But it would be worthless if they died in a flash flood while trying to reach federal authorities who might actually listen to their testimony and act on the information they had risked everything to obtain. As they prepared to leave Black Mesa with their precious cargo of documents and devastating proof of Franklin's crimes, Evangeline felt the crushing weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden that made each step more difficult than the last. they weren't just fighting for their own freedom anymore. They were carrying evidence that could expose a conspiracy affecting hundreds of innocent families throughout the territorial Southwest people, who had trusted the wrong man and paid for that trust with their lives. "Whatever happens in those canyons," she said to Dasan, as they loaded their horses with supplies for the desperate journey ahead, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly. "These documents have to survive and reach honest authorities. Even if we don't make it out alive, someone has to know the truth about what Franklin has been doing." Dasan secured the papers in a waterproof oiled leather pouch, designed to protect them from both water damage and bullets, and then tied the pouch inside his shirt, where it would be protected by his body during whatever violence lay ahead in the narrow canyons of Devil's Gate. "We all survive," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had sustained them through every crisis they had faced so far. "That's the only plan worth making, and the only outcome I'm willing to accept." But as they rode out into the desert darkness on September 25th, with storm clouds gathering on the northern horizon and lightning flickering among distant peaks like the tongues of angry gods, all three adults understood that they were heading into a trap where survival would require not just courage and skill, but the kind of luck that had been in desperately short supply since their flight began. The conspiracy against them was larger and more ruthlessly organized than they had imagined, but they finally had the evidence needed to expose Franklin as not just a fraud, but a cold-blooded killer who had built his empire on systematic murder. The question now was whether they could stay alive long enough to present that evidence to federal authorities who weren't part of the corruption themselves, and whether justice could triumph over the kind of evil that wore a respectable face and hid behind legal documents. The first stage of the climax began at sunset on September 24th as storm clouds gathered over the northern mountains like an army of dark angels, and the narrow canyons of Devil's Gate began to echo with the ominous rumble of distant thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. Silas had chosen his trap with the cunning of a man who understood how to use the desert's own violence as a weapon, and the ancient geological formation created natural bottlenecks where flash floods could rise 20 feet in minutes, turning familiar passages into roaring death traps that spared neither man nor beast. Evangeline, Nellie, and Dasan approached through the maze of side canyons that surrounded the main formation, carrying their precious evidence in waterproof pouches, while the first fat raindrops began to fall from slate-gray skies that seemed to press down on them with the weight of impending doom. The air itself seemed to vibrate with approaching menace, charged with electrical energy that made their horses skittish and their own nerves raw with anticipation of violence that could come from any direction. "They're already in position," Dasan observed, studying the rim rocks through his field glasses, with the focused intensity of a man who understood that one mistake in reading the tactical situation could mean death for all of them. Silas Iron Hand with his wounded gun hand, and at least 4 others I can see. They've got every exit covered except the main canyon, which is exactly where the flood will be strongest when it hits. The sound of distant water was already building from a whisper to a low growl that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself, carried on desert wind that brought the scent of rain and the promise of destruction. In the slot canyons of the Southwest, flash floods were legendary for their speed and devastating violence, walls of churning debris that could move boulders the size of houses and strip flesh from bone in seconds, leaving behind scoured rock faces and tangled masses of timber metal and bone. "How long do we have before the water reaches us?" Evangeline asked, though she could already see the answer written in Dasan's grim expression, and the way he checked his weapons with the methodical care of a man preparing for a battle he wasn't sure he could win. "Maybe an hour before the flood hits with full force," he replied, studying the darkening sky and calculating the time it would take for the storm water to travel down from the mountains through the network of arroyos and washes that fed into the main canyon system. Less if the storm moves faster than expected, or if there's been more rain upstream than we can see from here. That was when Silas's voice echoed off the canyon walls with the amplified menace of a man who held all the advantages and knew it. His words carrying clearly through the natural acoustics of the stone corridors that had become their trap. "Come on out, Mrs. Franklin." "No," he shouted, his voice bouncing off the towering walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Nowhere left to run now. These canyons flood regular as clockwork during storm season, and you folks are gonna drown like rats in a rain barrel if you don't surrender right now and accept the inevitable." The tactical situation was desperate, but not entirely hopeless, though their options were limited by the terrain and their enemies' superior numbers and positions and the approaching natural disaster that would kill them just as effectively as bullets if they made the wrong choice. Dasan had spotted an old mining tunnel about 40 feet up the canyon wall, a silver working from the 1860s that should be above the flood line if they could reach it alive, and if the water didn't rise higher than historical precedent suggested it might. But getting there meant exposing themselves to rifle fire from multiple directions while climbing treacherous rock faces made slippery by increasing rain, all while protecting a 12-year-old child who had no experience with such dangers and whose safety had to be their primary concern, regardless of the cost to themselves. "I'll go first and secure a rope," Dasan decided after studying the cliff face and calculating angles of fire from the positions where their enemies waited like spiders in a web. "When I signal, you follow with Nellie. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just climb like your life depends on it, because it does." The ascent began just as the first serious gunshots rang out, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off stone walls while bullets sparked off wet rock around them and sent chips of sandstone flying like shrapnel. Iron Hand had spotted Dasan's movement and opened fire with his Winchester. Despite the awkwardness of shooting with his wounded hand, his aim effective, but still deadly enough to make their climb a race between speed and accuracy. Evangeline provided covering fire with the Colt revolver Dasan had given her, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird trying to escape, while she tried to keep the gunmen's heads down through sheer volume of fire rather than precision. Her shots were wild at first, dictated more by desperation than skill. But desperation and determination began to steady her aim as she found the rhythm of combat and understood what was required of her. The physical demands of the climb were brutal, pulling herself up rock faces that would have challenged experienced mountaineers, with the added burden of helping Nellie navigate obstacles that were beyond the child's strength and reach. Her hands were soon raw and bleeding from the rough stone, her muscles screaming with exhaustion. But the sound of rising water below them provided all the motivation she needed to keep moving upward toward the promise of temporary safety. The flood hit just as they reached the tunnel entrance, and Evangeline understood for the first time why flash floods in slot canyons were spoken of with the kind of reverence usually reserved for acts of divine wrath. It came around the bend, like the physical manifestation of destruction itself, a wall of churning brown water 20 feet high that filled the canyon from wall to wall, with terrifying completeness, carrying logs, boulders, dead animals, and mining debris in a thunderous torrent that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. The roar was deafening, drowning out shouts and gunfire as both hunters and hunted scrambled desperately for higher ground, while the desert suddenly transformed itself into a raging river of unimaginable power. 2 of Silas's men didn't make it to safety in time, caught in the open when the water arrived with the speed of a cavalry charge. Evangeline caught a horrifying glimpse of them being swept away by the churning flood, their screams lost in the thunder of moving water as their horses reared and bolted in panic before being overwhelmed by the brown torrent that showed no mercy to man or beast. Silas himself barely reached a narrow ledge 20 feet up the opposite wall. His face a mask of fury and disbelief as he watched his carefully laid trap destroy his own men instead of his intended victims. Iron Hand found precarious shelter in a crevice that kept him above the rising water, but trapped him on the wrong side of the newly formed river, his wounded hand making it impossible for him to climb to better position. Safe in the mining tunnel that had become their refuge, they watched the familiar landscape transform into something alien and terrifying. A raging torrent that bore no resemblance to the dry washes and peaceful arroyos they had traveled through just hours before. The sound was overwhelming, not just the roar of water, but the grinding crash of boulders tumbling over each other, the splintering of trees torn from distant mountainsides, the percussion of debris smashing against canyon walls with impacts that sent vibrations through solid rock. It won't last more than a few hours, Dasan said, studying the raging flood with the professional assessment of a man who had seen such forces before and understood their patterns. But that's long enough for them to find another way around if we stay here like sitting ducks waiting for the water to drop. The abandoned silver mine extended deep into the mountain, its timber-shored passages black as a tomb beyond the reach of their small lantern, filled with the musty smell of decades-old air and the constant drip of water seeping through stone. They moved carefully through the ancient workings, testing each step on rotted planking and loose rock, while their voices echoed strangely in chambers that might have been carved by miners' picks or by forces far older than human habitation. But their respite was temporary, and they knew it. Once the flood subsided, Silas would find a way to reach them, and the narrow tunnel would become a trap rather than a refuge. Their only chance lay in using the chaos and confusion of the flood's aftermath to escape while their enemies were still regrouping and reassessing their own situation. The evidence. Evangeline said, suddenly checking her waterproof pouch with growing horror as she realized what the violent climb and desperate scramble for safety had cost them. The map, the guardianship papers, their water damaged beyond recognition. The devastating realization hit all three of them simultaneously, like a physical blow to the chest. In their desperate flight from the flood, the original documents that proved Franklin's conspiracy had been destroyed by the very water that had saved their lives from Silas's trap. They still had Margaret's photographs and copies tucked safely away, but those would carry less weight in federal court without the originals to support their authenticity and establish an unbroken chain of evidence. "We have to go back," Evangeline said with the quiet determination of a woman who had been pushed beyond her breaking point and discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. "We have to face Franklin directly with whatever evidence we have left. It's the only way to end this nightmare once and for all." "That's suicide," Dasan replied flatly, his military training making him automatically calculate the odds of survival in a direct confrontation with a man who controlled half the territorial government and had unlimited resources to throw against them. Franklin controls Crow's Landing like a feudal lord. Going back there is exactly what he wants. It puts us on his ground, surrounded by his people, with no way out if things go wrong. "Then we make sure we choose the time and place," Evangeline said, her voice growing stronger as a plan began to form in her mind with the clarity that sometimes came in moments of extreme crisis. Margaret mentioned that federal marshals occasionally visit the territorial offices to conduct routine inspections. If we can time our return to coincide with one of those visits, force a confrontation in front of witnesses who can't be bought or intimidated. It was a desperate gamble that depended on timing luck and the hope that there were still honest men in positions of authority who would listen to their story and act on the evidence they could provide. But as the flood gradually subsided and revealed the changed landscape below, scoured clean of familiar landmarks and littered with debris that told the story of the water's violent passage, they realized it might be their only chance to see justice done. and Franklin's reign of terror brought to an end. The second stage of their climax began 3 days later on the morning of September 27th, when they reached Crow's Landing after a hard ride through country still muddy from the storm and transformed by the passage of floodwaters that had rearranged the very geography of the region. The town looked deceptively peaceful in the early sunlight, its dusty streets and adobe buildings giving no hint of the corruption and violence that festered beneath the surface, like poison in an untreated wound. Margaret Chen met them at the schoolhouse with news that both encouraged and terrified them in equal measure, information that would determine whether their desperate gamble had any chance of success or whether they were walking into a trap that would end with their deaths and Franklin's ultimate victory. Federal Marshal Crawford arrived yesterday with 2 deputies. She reported her face grave with the knowledge of what their return meant and the dangers they would face in the next few hours. They're investigating reports of territorial corruption and systematic violations of federal mining law. But Franklin's been feeding them a steady stream of lies about Apache uprisings, missing government funds, and dangerous fugitives who need to be arrested on sight before they can spread their poisonous propaganda. "Where are the marshals now?" Dasan asked, already calculating distances, escape routes, and the tactical considerations that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few hours. "Pierce's office reviewing evidence that Franklin's been preparing for weeks." Margaret replied, her expression hardening with disgust at the systematic deception they were facing. "But I've been gathering testimony from miners and their families, people who've seen what Franklin's operation really does to anyone who gets in its way." Dr. Hart's prepared a detailed medical report about the poisoning cases, complete with chemical analysis and expert opinions that should carry weight with honest federal authorities. The plan they devised was dangerous in its simplicity, dependent on split-second timing, and the hope that truth would prove stronger than the web of lies Franklin had been weaving for months. Evangeline would enter Pierce's office, openly demanding to present evidence of Franklin's crimes to the federal authorities before they could be swayed completely by his version of events. Margaret and Dr. Hart would be there as witnesses and expert testimony, while Dasan positioned himself where he could intervene if violence erupted, which seemed almost inevitable given Franklin's desperation and the amount of money and power he stood to lose if the truth came out. What none of them anticipated was the depths of Franklin's desperation and his willingness to commit any crime, no matter how heinous, to protect the empire he had built on the bones of his victims. The confrontation began calmly enough, with all the surface courtesy that characterized legal proceedings in territorial courtrooms, where the forms of civilization were maintained, even when justice had been sold to the highest bidder. Marshal Crawford, a weathered man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and the skeptical demeanor of someone who had seen too much corruption in his years of federal service, listened politely as Evangeline presented her case with all the eloquence she could muster. Dr. Hart's medical testimony about the systematic arsenic poisoning was particularly compelling, backed by chemical analysis and expert knowledge that was difficult to dismiss, even by officials who might have been inclined to accept Franklin's version of events. Margaret's carefully documented evidence of territorial corruption began to raise serious questions about Deputy Pierce's activities and the legitimacy of the legal documents being used to justify their pursuit. "These are grave accusations, Miss Muller," Crawford said carefully, using her maiden name after examining the evidence and beginning to understand the scope of the deception they were facing. "If proven true in federal court, they would constitute multiple capital crimes, warranting the death penalty under territorial and federal law. That was when Franklin made his fatal mistake, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the pressure of seeing his life's work threatened by the testimony of people he had dismissed as powerless and irrelevant. She's lying through her teeth." He burst out, his face flushing red with fury and desperation as the walls began to close in around him. "That woman is my legal wife. under territorial law, and she's been coached by Apache renegades and Chinese agitators to make false accusations designed to destroy the reputation of honest businessmen who've worked hard to bring civilization and prosperity to this wilderness. Mr. Franklin, Crawford said mildly, his tone carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades dealing with criminals who thought they were smarter than the law. I'm beginning to think these accusations may not be as false as you claim. And your reaction suggests you have more to hide than a simple case of marital discord. Franklin's face went white as he realized how much his outburst had revealed about his true character and the desperation that drove his actions. In that moment of clarity, he understood that legal maneuvering and bought testimony would not be enough to save him from the consequences of his crimes, which left him with only one option for escaping justice. The derringer appeared in his hand with practiced speed as he grabbed Nellie, pulling the terrified child against his chest as a human shield while pressing the small pistol against her head with the casual brutality of a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of human decency. Nobody moves a goddamn muscle. He snarled, his voice cracking with the strain of a man who saw his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. I'm taking what's rightfully mine and leaving this territory tonight. And if anyone tries to stop me, the girl dies first and the woman second. You want their blood on your hands, Marshal, because I guarantee you, I've got nothing left to lose, and every reason to take as many of you with me as I can manage. The next few seconds unfolded with crystalline clarity, each moment stretching like hours as everyone in the room calculated angles, distances, and the deadly mathematics of violence that could leave an innocent child dead if anyone made the wrong choice. Evangeline saw the terror in Nellie's eyes and felt her own world narrow to a single point of deadly focus, all her fears and doubts burned away by the primitive fury of a woman whose family was being threatened by a monster who wore the mask of civilization. Dasan was moving before anyone else could react, his Apache training and years of combat experience, giving him the split-second advantage that might mean the difference between life and death for an innocent child. But he was too far away to reach Franklin before the man could pull the trigger too far to prevent a tragedy that would haunt everyone in the room for the rest of their lives. It was Evangeline who acted with desperate precision, born of pure maternal instinct, drawing the Colt revolver with movements that had been practiced and refined through weeks of survival in hostile territory. The gun bucked in her hand as she fired with careful aim that took Franklin in the shoulder, spinning him away from Nellie and sending his derringer flying across the room to clatter harmlessly against the wall. Franklin screamed as the bullet tore through muscle and bone, dropping him to his knees, while blood soaked through his expensive suit, and his carefully maintained facade of respectability finally crumbled completely. The wound was serious, but not fatal, exactly what Evangeline had intended when she chose her target with the cold calculation of someone who understood that justice required Franklin to live long enough to face the consequences of his crimes. It's over, Marshal Crawford said quietly as his deputies secured the wounded Franklin and Dr. Hart moved to tend his injuries with the professional competence of a man who had treated bullet wounds before. It's finally over, and justice will be served. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive, carried out with the efficiency of federal authorities who finally had the evidence and witnesses they needed to expose a conspiracy that had operated in the shadows for too long. Franklin's systematic campaign of murder and fraud was laid bare in all its horrific detail, with testimony provided by victims throughout the territory who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. Deputy Pierce received a life sentence for his role in the corruption, his career and reputation destroyed by the revelation of how thoroughly he had betrayed his oath of office and the trust of the people he was supposed to protect. Franklin himself was sentenced to hang for multiple counts of murder, though the irony of frontier justice decreed that he would die in prison of complications from his bullet wound before the sentence could be carried out. A fate that seemed grimly appropriate, given the slow poison he had used to murder Evangeline's mother and countless others. But justice, while satisfying, could not undo the damage that had been done, or restore the lives that had been lost to Franklin's greed and ambition. The survivors would carry the scars of their ordeal for the rest of their lives, and the families of his victims would never see their loved ones again, no matter how complete their legal victory might be. The story might have ended there, with evil punished and the innocent protected by the long arm of federal law. But life in the Arizona Territory had a way of offering unexpected gifts to those who had suffered enough and earned the right to happiness through their courage and determination. In going through Franklin's confiscated property during the legal proceedings, the territorial court discovered something remarkable that would change the trajectory of their lives in ways none of them could have anticipated. Among the documents seized from his office was a homestead deed for 80 acres of prime land near Willow Springs, filed under Evangeline's fraudulent married name, but completely legal, and binding nonetheless under the complex web of territorial property law. The irony was perfect and somehow satisfying in a way that simple justice could never be. Franklin's attempt to trap Evangeline in a false marriage had inadvertently provided her with the legal foundation for a new life, and the very documents he had used to control her had become the instruments of her freedom and independence. The land is yours by right under territorial law, Marshal Crawford explained with obvious satisfaction as he handed her the deed that represented far more than mere property ownership. The marriage was fraudulent, but the property transfer was properly filed and paid for with Franklin's own money. Federal law requires the territory to honor the deed, regardless of the circumstances under which it was originally executed. On a warm morning in March 1880, 6 months after the final legal proceedings had concluded and Franklin's criminal empire had been dismantled by federal authorities, Evangeline stood on the porch of their new cabin at Willow Springs, watching Nellie practice her letters under the patient guidance of Margaret Chen, who had agreed to continue the girl's education and had become like family to them in the aftermath of their shared ordeal. The land stretched out before them in all directions, 80 acres of possibility, where they could build whatever future they chose, free from the shadows of the past and the fear that had dominated their lives for so long. The property included good water rights, fertile soil suitable for farming, and enough timber resources to support whatever construction projects they might undertake as they established their new home. Dasan approached from the barn, where he'd been tending their small herd of cattle, the beginning of what they hoped would become a profitable ranching operation that could support their growing family and provide them with the financial independence that had always been more dream than reality during their previous lives. Their relationship had grown slowly but surely from shared survival into something deeper and more enduring. Not the desperate romance of dime novels or the hasty marriages of convenience that were common on the frontier, but the solid partnership of two people who had chosen each other after seeing the worst and best of what they could be under pressure. "The crops are coming in well," he reported, settling beside her on the wooden steps they had built together during the long winter months when the desert was too cold for outdoor work. "And the mining survey Dr. Hart arranged shows real promise for the copper deposits we've been hearing about from other landowners in the area. Enough to send Nellie to college back east when she's ready." Evangeline asked, though she already knew the answer from the satisfaction in his voice and the way his eyes lit up when he talked about their plans for the future. "More than enough," Dasan confirmed, then added with the characteristic practicality that had kept them alive through their darkest hours. "Assuming we can keep the operation small enough to manage ourselves and avoid the kind of expansion that might attract the attention of people who want to take what we've built." They had talked about marriage in the legal sense, but both agreed that the commitment they had already made to each other meant more than any ceremony could add to their relationship. They were partners in every sense that mattered in work, in raising Nellie and building the life they had fought so hard to protect. and the bonds forged in the crucible of shared danger were stronger than any legal document could make them. As the sun set behind the distant mountains on that March evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that spoke eloquently of endings and new beginnings, Evangeline reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and possibility. The whispered bargain she had made beside a wrecked stagecoach, "I can cook, I can clean, I can be quiet," had somehow transformed into something far more precious, a true partnership between equals who had chosen each other freely and completely. When Dasan reached over and took her hand in his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing, she felt the last traces of fear and uncertainty finally fade away, like shadows before the dawn. His touch was warm and sure, speaking of promises kept and a future they would build together through honest work, mutual respect, and the kind of love that grew from shared trials and proven loyalty. Nellie's delighted laughter rang out across their land as she successfully spelled a particularly difficult word, the sound carrying on the evening breeze like music that celebrated their hard-won freedom and the family they had chosen to become. The sound filled Evangeline with a profound sense of completion and the knowledge that her mother's dying wish had been fulfilled in ways the woman could never have imagined when she pressed that small key into her daughter's hand and whispered her final words about trusting the church people and finding what was hidden where the Lord watched over them. They were safe, they were free, and they were together three people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and discovered that family was not about blood or legal documents, but about who you chose to protect when the world turned dangerous and the easy choices disappeared. And that, Evangeline thought, as the first stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky above their new home, was worth more than all the silver and gold that had ever been pulled from the territorial mountains, more valuable than any treasure that could be counted in dollars or weighed on a scale. They had found their way home at last, and home was whatever place they chose to build together through love, determination, and the unshakable bonds of a family forged in fire and tempered by trials that had only made them stronger.